Hi Year 13, so as promised I will go ahead and record the Rossetti poetry in the same way that I have done the poems of the decade. Now with the Rossetti, obviously you've got the introduction lesson that we covered as well, just that sort of broke down the exam for you and explained to you the assessment objectives. So be sure that when you're revising this that you do actually go back and look at that as well, so that you're sort of using that when we are analysing and going through the poems. So what I will do, I'll use the PowerPoints that we've used in lessons as well to support during this recording, and obviously if you were not in the lesson then just be sure that you are pausing at the correct times and having a go at the activities when necessary, and then obviously just adding to what it has been sort of either discussed in the lesson, which I'll sort of make reference to, and adding then on any annotations with what I'm going through as well on my copy of the poem. So as always I'll start with that starting activity. Now a lot of the starting activities I have chosen for this unit of work are more context based because as I said in that introduction lesson, if you look over it, it does highlight the fact that you have to talk about context for this part of the exam, so you will need to draw on contextual information. Therefore, for our starting activity, have a little look at the two questions that are on the screen there for you. What can you recall of male and female roles in the Victorian era? And what do you understand of feminism during the Victorian era? So, as I said, if you were not in this lesson, can we just pause at this point and have a little go at recalling that yourself before I go through the responses for that? Hopefully you have paused there. So the responses to these questions then. What can you recall of male and female roles in the Victorian era? Now, during the Victorian era, men lived more public lives, and attributes such as logic, reasoning, independence and aggression were seen as very masculine. Men from the emerging middle and upper classes in particular were well educated. Subjects such as maths, biology, astrology and chemistry were viewed as masculine subjects, so that is what boys were taught from a young age. Women, on the other hand, were meant to live more private lives. Women were typically seen as shy, weak and emotional. So women, even those in the upper classes and aristocracy, were not as well educated as men. They were not permitted to study to degree level and were taught subjects such as Latin, music and needlepoint. And those were seen then as obviously very typical female subjects. It was very unusual for women to be taught mathematics, biology, astrology and chemistry. Now there were some women that obviously went against the grain of that and started to kind of pursue some of those subjects, but it was very, very rare and it was very much frowned upon. Women had sort of lives that were meant to shape them, young children. As children, girls were educated to fulfill the role of housewife and mother. So what do you understand of feminism during the Victorian era? Bit of a misleading question really, because feminism as a concept didn't really exist during the Victorian era. The term feminism wasn't coined in the Victorian era, so therefore feminism didn't really exist in that sense. If you mentioned a feminist to a Victorian, they would not know what you meant. The term didn't exist. The Victorian era, though, was the birth of the modern feminist movement. Writers such as Virginia Woolf wrote with an aim to illustrate the societal constraints of women, so how women were confined to the roles that they were given. And others, such as Emmeline Pankhurst, strove for women's suffrage, so the right for women to vote. And you've no doubt heard that, especially if you studied Inspector Calls. So many early feminists were dismissed as mentally ill or worse. Some were in prison for facing police brutality and force feeding. So it was horrific conditions for those who sort of questioned, for those women who did question their place in society and sort of went against the ideal of what a woman should be during the Victorian era. So, coming to this poem then, and hopefully you will be able to make some links between some of those ideas and this particular poem. Now, this was written when Rossetti was quite young, so whether that has some influence on her kind of perspective of things, you can decide that. You can make your own critical opinion on that. But we have this poem, "Some ladies dress in muslin full and white." Now, there isn't necessarily a title for this, so we refer to it by that first line of the poem. As always, I will put up those questions to have a little think about. So what can you infer from the title of the poem, that being the first line of the poem? What form has the poem been written in, and what is the effect? And when you are thinking about that, make sure that you refer to the version on the screen, because obviously the version they've printed here, they have put a word there. They've changed it onto this line here. So just refer to the screen version for that question. And how are men and women presented in the poem? So thinking carefully then, that is one of the main themes here in this poem. How are men and women presented? And in particular, how are they presented as either adhering to the expectations of the time, the roles at the time, and then obviously going against that, and obviously what Rossetti herself feels and thinks about them based on that. So as I said, if you were not in the lesson, just pause at this point so you can get your own critical perspective on the poem before we kind of dive into an analysis. Reading through the poem then. So, some ladies dress in muslin full and white, some gentlemen in cloth succinct and black. Some patronise a dog cart, some a hack, some think a painted Clarence only right. Youth isn't always such a pleasing sight. Witness a man with tassels on his back, or woman in a great coat like a sack, towering above her sex with horrid height. If all the world were water fit to drown, there are some whom you would not teach to swim, rather enjoying if you saw them sink, certain old ladies dressed in girlish pink, with roses and geraniums on their gown, go to the basin, poke 'em over the rim. Hopefully you've paused there then and you've had a little go answering those questions, so you've got your own perspective on the poem before I offer my suggestions then. So we'll go through it. I'll do as I usually do, just breaking it down, and I will sort of pause at certain points, because within this poem, I know I usually talk about structure at the end, but I'll just mention it here because it kind of fits with where I'll pause and discuss things. So this is written as a sonnet, so 14-line sonnet, and you have got, it's a Petrarchan sonnet, so there are rules that are applied to that, which means that the first 8 lines will focus on one particular aspect, and then there will be a volta, a shift. So the first 8 lines being the octave or octet, and then the last 6 lines being the sestet. So you've got then the volta at this point where it talks about just underneath where it says towering above her sex with horrid height. So there's where we have a shift or a change. So I'll focus kind of on the first 8 lines and discuss those before then kind of delving into the sestet. So we have then this opening. So interestingly here as well, the use of anaphora. It's being almost quite sweeping, quite general with who Rossetti is referring to. There are no specifics being mentioned here. Some ladies, some gentlemen, some patronise, some think. So, you know, she is there almost being quite mocking as well in the way that she is identifying obviously a particular group of people when she is writing this poem. So she starts off with the ladies, and it does seem that she is harsher towards her own sex, actually. Towards women she tends to be harsher, because she mentions men, but in the way that she mentions men, it's very briefly in comparison to the way that she discusses and focuses on women. So some ladies dress in muslin full and white. So we've got then this almost embodiment of femininity, this idea of muslin, which is quite a sort of, it's a bit coarser than silk or satin, but it's sort of a symbol of femininity, of purity as well, particularly when describing the sort of full and white. Full almost creating those connotations and those ideas of linking back to the figure of a woman being a bit more full and voluptuous than men. So it's very much descriptions here of femininity. These adjectives linking stereotypically to femininity, and particularly white having those sort of the colour connotations, colour imagery towards purity. And then she switches to men, so some gentlemen in cloth, succinct and black. Now, interesting as well here, you've got this sort of juxtaposition, this antithesis between the description of women and men, whereas women's clothes are full and therefore maybe a little bit more flamboyant, maybe almost like a little bit too much. So women have this need to kind of show off and emphasize their femininity, whereas for men they can be quite succinct and it's very plain and smart. And black as well, showing direct antithesis to white, black and white. So this idea as well of there being such a big contrast and difference between men and women, and black almost suggesting more of a kind of logical, dark colour, which contrasts with that white, that feminine, light, pure colour. Some patronise that they just mean sort of higher pay for. A dog cart, some a hack, some think a painted Clarence only right. Now, this sort of list, this asyndetic list that we have, the dog cart, the hack, and the painted Clarence, these are all types of carriage that she's talking about. The dog cart is probably the most basic, and we can infer that as well from the way it's kind of described. This is almost colloquial in the way she's describing it. The dog cart, then the hack, which is kind of a hackney cab, which is a little bit more covered and would offer a bit more protection than a dog cart, because the dog cart would be very, very basic and not necessarily have a cover to it, whereas the painted Clarence would be a much fancier version of a carriage. Think of the one, if you Google search it, the one that sort of the Queen rides in, for example. On special occasions it would be that, it would be completely covered, and they'd have kind of the driver sat towards the back so that the person can see ahead of them as well. So very much this tripling is kind of pointing out the wealth and expense, almost mockingly again, this idea of sort of going over the top with things, and almost accumulating in the opulence as well. I'm going to just bring this a little bit closer for you. But it sort of increases in opulence. So it starts with the sort of basic dog cart and then snowballs into the painted Clarence. And again, it's mocking there. It's that materialism that she's kind of poking fun at. Youth is not always such a pleasing sight. So she's very scathing towards her own, not only her own sex, but actually towards her own age group. Because as I said, she did write this when she was quite young. Youth is not always such a pleasing sight, and there's a contradiction even within that. So this idea, you know, when we think of youth, the connotations there usually are quite positive. This idea of being young and pretty. Actually, she's saying that it's not such a pleasing sight. So it's a contradiction there. Witness a man with tassels on his back. Tassels suggesting almost a feminine attribute, something that's excessive, not needed, and it is just for show. And she's being quite mocking of that as well. Witness a man with tassels on his back. Almost seems unnatural there as well. Or woman in a great coat like a sack. Now, again, you can see the difference here. She mentions that witness a man with tassels on his back. It's, again, mocking, but it's not quite as sort of harsh a jibe as the next one for the woman. So, or woman in a great coat like a sack. So great coat obviously suggesting it's quite shapeless, and like a sack sort of reinforcing that as well, that it's shapeless, it doesn't look feminine, and sort of mocking the woman for almost looking masculine in her appearance. And that's reinforced then by the verb, very critically talking about the woman towering above her sex with horrid height. So it could be that suggesting that feminism in its early heydays was not something that Rossetti sort of agreed with, put it that way, that she agreed with, and it's almost like with disdain that she's using that verb. It's suggesting that women who do believe in feminism see themselves as above other women, and therefore kind of towering above her sex with horrid height. And the alliteration here, that alliterative feel, it sort of emphasises her disgust, and that's that sort of adjective, horrid height, again emphasising how disgusted and how unpleasant she views this and how she sees this. But you can make a contextual link here, this idea that feminism, this early feminist movement that didn't refer to itself as feminism, but this early movement for women's rights, and changing women's roles within society was something that disgusts her, in particular because of her religious belief. So religiously, Rossetti had the belief that God assigned the roles of men and women to men and women, and therefore to go against that role, to not behave in a feminine way as women were expected to behave in during that era in society, is to go against God. And because Rossetti was so highly religious, she completely disagrees with that. And same then for men as well, this idea of if you're not going to behave in a masculine way, that you are going against the role that God has assigned you in society. And as I said, because of her deep belief in religion, she would have been disgusted with that. And we see that in her description here. So that sort of, the octave there really gives us all these examples of men and women being both materialistic, but also not necessarily adhering to their roles in society, and sort of veering away from what it means to be masculine and feminine. You have to kind of view this poem in that context, because obviously, thankfully, society has moved on from these ideas, and we see gender now as more of a spectrum rather than just two opposite binaries. But we have to realise that obviously in the context of the Victorian era, people like Rossetti, those that were highly religious, would have had a very negative view of not keeping and staying with this very strict belief of gender and what it means to be female and what it means to be male. We then have this Volta, and the biblical religious imagery here that is sort of focused on maybe links into this belief, these religious views of how men and women should behave. So if all the world were water fit to drown, so it's a reference here, biblical reference to the Bible and the tale of Noah's Ark, because God sent a flood to purge the world almost of sinners, and that's what happened. And she's making reference to that again, almost suggesting that that's what's needed, a cleansing, where we can sort of start again and go back to what God intended. Okay. There are some whom you would not teach to swim. So it's quite dark there, and actually quite ironic, because if she's talking about the Bible, one of the things that the Bible teaches is thou shalt not kill, and yet she's sort of having these almost quite dark, meant to be humorous thoughts about this idea of purging and sort of killing off those who are not adhering to the teachings of the Bible. So it's almost ironic there as well. Rather enjoying if you saw them sink. And that idea as well, that verb enjoying, it's how she's using that as well, because obviously as a modern audience we see that and interpret that as her being almost quite sadistic with what she's suggesting. She'd be joyful and happy to see people suffering and dying because they are not adhering to the teachings of the Bible. And like I said, it's ironic because actually the whole point in Christianity is to be a better person, to be a good person, and that seems almost contradictory to that. But again, we have to try and interpret this as well with her thoughts and her ideas and her contextual upbringing, because she was brought up to be highly religious. And actually, it's not necessarily that she's enjoying them suffering and dying in this great flood that she wishes could cleanse the earth, but more taking joy in God doing the work of God, doing what is right. And she's more talking about that, not necessarily this idea then of people suffering. So rather enjoying if you saw them sink. And I said, it's extremely critical at this point. You've got this biblical link. Certain old ladies dressed in girlish pink. So again, coming back to women and being highly critical of them. Certain old ladies, the adjective old then kind of contradicting, juxtaposing with girlish, the adjective girlish to describe the colour of pink that they're wearing. And again, quite mocking, quite critical of older women, sort of showing how overdone they are, overdressed, and how unnecessary how their dressing is. Again, almost tying back to this materialism, with roses and geraniums on their gowns. So, these very flowered, patented clothing that these women are wearing, almost to maybe recapture their youth, or potentially because they're drawing attention to themselves. And we've got then as well this reference here, so go to the basin, so in other words suggesting the edge of the world. And this again is, so you've got the caesura here, and that break is meant to allow for this kind of humorous tone, reinforced by this colloquial language, poke them over the rim, so you poke them off the edge of the world for what they're doing, for what they're wearing. So it does come across very mocking, very critical, but also it does seem to be quite sarcastically humorous. It's meant to have an element of that. And again, as I said, really we need to kind of think of this in the context of the time she's writing this, because obviously views and ideas have sort of moved on. And, I think we've got to be very aware here. We don't want to sort of criticize her beliefs. Many people still do believe in Christianity and the Bible, and we have to be sort of mindful of that. And although there may well be some people that do still adhere to the ideas of the Bible and this idea of the roles of women and men, but actually there are people then that have, as society has developed and progressed, have kind of moved away from those ideas and actually developed, particularly as I mentioned when it comes to gender roles and how that has kind of changed and adapted over time. So I did mention here then this idea of a sonnet. Now, interesting use of a sonnet there as well, because actually sonnets typically are used when discussing love poetry, that tends to be the theme. And in terms of then linking this to the idea of love, I think it might be a bit too tenuous really to say that there is links to love here. You could potentially talk about materialism and this idea then of maybe almost like a narcissism when it comes to the way people dress, and you could potentially make a link there between the idea of loving yourself and being narcissistic, and that being an idea within this poem. But that might be a little bit of a stretch, to be honest. I think you'd be more, you'd gain more marks, you'd be more secure talking about more the structure of the sonnet in terms of having the octave and the sestet and that volta, and how in the octave she focuses more on listing the various sort of gender roles and how people either adhere to them or don't, and then this contrasting then in the sestet, sort of almost giving a solution or wishing for a solution for some of these problems that she's outlined in the octave, and having that sort of shift in tone then towards the volta, where it becomes in the sestet a bit more sort of dark, sarcastic, and it's meant to be humorous then as well. Whether we'll see it as that as a modern audience is kind of, as I said, your own critical perspective on that. You may not see it as humorous at all. In fact, for some people, and I know that this was sort of part of the lesson, for some people it's quite the opposite, that it's not humorous at all. And that's fine. You can discuss that and talk about a modern interpretation of it, absolutely. But it's worth kind of putting in there an interpretation based on your contextual understanding of what we know about Rossetti, particularly with her strong religious views. Okay, so thinking about themes then, so within this poem we have culture and society, so the poem obviously outlines the expectations placed upon men and women. Gender, clear divide between what is acceptable for men and women, and I think Rossetti there is almost quite clear in her attitude towards those who do not conform to the gender stereotypes of the time. Feminism, so again, be very mindful when you're talking about feminism with Rossetti. Feminism wasn't necessarily a movement or a term at that point. We had the beginnings of feminism, but when we are talking about feminism in Rossetti's time, we are talking about the very early beginnings of feminism, and the movement as such hadn't really been formed yet. So Rossetti appears to reject the modern feminist notion, so thinking now about feminist notions, she completely rejects that, and we can talk about that from obviously a modern perspective. So Rossetti appears to reject the modern feminist notion that men and women can be more fluid in their gender roles. So as ever, I've got the links there, so you can have a little look at where I have kind of checked on my own interpretation and seen what other people have said, and either offered an alternative to what I believed, or sort of reinforced what I've thought about the poem as well. But again, I'd encourage you to kind of have a little look and find other notes then that you can add to your own interpretation, and obviously my analysis there as well. Hopefully that's helped. Any issues, please, as always, drop me a little message in our Google Classroom or drop me a little email.